She didn't wear veils like the others, not because she was free, but because she had already been stripped bare by fate itself. Her body, marked by glances and coins, walked between walls as if she knew more than any scribe. Among the stones of Jericho and the whispers of merchants, she was called a prostitute, but the heavens, silently, called her by another name. There was something about her that even the angels dared not ignore. Her footsteps echoed between columns like an ancient song, a forgotten melody that carried promises not revealed in the tablets of the law. Rahab was not a saint, nor did she want to be. She was an instrument. She was a loophole. She was the womb where the improbable germinated into the inevitable. That night, as soldiers searched doors and priests invoked protection, she lay with God's chosen one, not for pleasure, but for purpose. And it was in that room, steeped in sin, fear, and perfume, that something changed forever. There was no altar. There was no blessing. Just two bodies and a silent pact that centuries had tried to hide under layers of morality. What happened between Rahab and that man was not recounted from pulpits nor recited in synagogues, but it was there that shame became an alliance and desire a divine tool. Because sometimes God begins a new story in the bed of a woman everyone condemned, except him. They say Rahab merely hid spies, but what she truly hid was much greater. She hid a secret that changed the Messiah's lineage, a pact sealed not with blood, but with a touch, a choice made not on the mountain but in the bedroom. What if I told you that the woman who saved Israel with her shame left more than a mark on the walls of Jericho? That there, on the most unlikely night in history, something was born, something that would link prostitution to the birth of the promise? For centuries, theologians overlooked this detail. Rabbis remained silent. Churches ignored it. But David's royal lineage has a name. That causes discomfort. Rahab. At the end of this video, you'll discover what happened after that night. A detail buried in the genealogies. A name whispered amidst scandal and glory. The truth about the womb that sheltered the improbable. And when you know, you may never read the Bible the same way again. Perhaps you realize that the sacred has always been bolder than we've been told, and that the divine plan began where no one would dare look. If this story has already made your silence, tremble inside. Press like as if holding an ancient secret in your hands. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel before the walls of oblivion rise again. Jericho wasn't just a walled city. It was an ancient scar embedded in the desert, where the winds seemed to carry not dust but forgotten memories. Its walls didn't just protect people, they hid secrets, pacts, fears. The sun, cruel and golden, beat against the stones as if to tear the truth from them. And within that fortress, suffocated by pride and idolatry, lived a woman everyone knew, but no one saw. Rahab, the one who belonged to no altar, the one who welcomed pilgrims, soldiers, strangers, but never prophets. Her name was whispered at night and spat out in the morning. But what no one imagined is that it would be precisely her name that would cross generations until it reached a royal genealogy. Before that, however, she was just another available body. A body trained to seduce, yes, but also to listen, to observe, to wait. Rahab's house stood on the walls, between the city and the abyss, between the known and the unseen. From there, she saw everything. She overheard conversations she shouldn't have. She knew roots, fears, weaknesses, and most dangerous of all, she knew how to touch men's minds without even touching them. They say God chooses who he wants, but they never said he would choose someone like her, a pagan prostitute, a woman without a veil, without sacrifices, without priests. And yet, that's where it all began. The city prepared for war. Men sharpened their swords, offering prayers to gods they no longer heard. The blood of arrogance flowed along with the wine of the feasts. But while the leaders grew drunk on the certainty of invincibility, Rahab watched the sky. She knew something was coming, something that didn't smell like war, but like promise. And it was on a starless night, when the wind seemed to hold its breath, that two men walked through the gates of Jericho like shadows. They weren't seeking pleasure. They were seeking hiding, and they found both. They found Rahab. What she said in that first exchange of glances, no one registered. What she saw in one of their eyes, no one understood. But it was there, in the tension of an encounter unforeseen by Scripture, that the destiny of a nation began to change. Maybe the story was never told properly. Maybe because it involved sheets, fear, and faith, all mixed together in the same room. Maybe because no one wanted to admit that God's plan began with the body of a woman men rejected. And have you ever stopped to think how many other stories like this were erased? Not because they were lies, but because they were dangerously true. The walls of Jericho weren't built simply to protect. They were erected as symbols of arrogance, like stone arms trying to block the inevitable. There was no entry without judgment, no room for the fragile. Each stacked stone carried the weight of fear disguised as strength. The houses huddled together like silent witnesses to a civilization that believed itself above the heavens. And among them, on top of them, on the edge of it all, stood Rahab's house, built not with prestige, but with cunning. She inhabited a liminal space, neither inside nor outside. From her window she saw the desert stretch into infinity, but she also heard the nocturnal groans of the neighboring houses. Her dwelling was made of clay, wood, and cloth, but inside was more mysterious than in the palaces of kings. The architecture of power doesn't always reveal itself with golden columns and thrones. Sometimes it hides in places where the sacred would never enter, and for this very reason, it acts with greater freedom. In Rahab's house, there were no enthroned idols, but there were symbols that spoke: perfumes, red fabrics, coins hidden under pillows. Everything in her home was ritual, every candle lit with intention, every chant whispered with precision, and every visitor who entered, even those who feigned contempt, left transformed. Jericho was a city dominated by a priestly and military elite who ruled with an iron fist and empty promises. Its leaders wore sacred robes to cover rotten alliances. In their temples, incense rose to the heavens, but desires crept between the pillars. Power was a constant spectacle, but Rahab, from the edge of the city, saw it all for what it was. She knew who plotted, who feared, who desired. You knew that a temple could be more corrupt than a brothel, and he knew that true power lay not in spears, but in secrets. Therefore her home was as feared as it was sought after. It was not just a refuge for bodies, but a sanctuary of confessions. There, maps were drawn with loose words, alliances with restrained moans, and decisions with touches that escaped the logic of generals. Jericho's architecture of power was immense, robust, and opulent, but all it took was one crack, a woman on the sidelines, an open window, an unlikely choice, for it all to come crashing down. Have you ever noticed how in the history of empires it is always the stones that cry out for justice, while the windows whisper revolutions? The women of Jericho didn't occupy thrones, but they dominated hallways. They didn't command armies, but they decided who returned alive from war. Their faces were ignored in official records, but their names were whispered among generals, scribes, and merchants. They learned early on that, in a world made by men, their bodies were the only territory they could defend and conquer. And some, like Rahab, understood that desire was more than pleasure. It was a diplomatic tool, an invisible key that opened doors sealed by oaths and fear. Female alliances were not sealed with blood or political pacts, but with silent gestures, favors promised on warm nights, and information gleaned from the intertwining of sheets. It was behind the scenes of pleasure that roots, hostages, currency, and territory were negotiated. The bed was more strategic than the throne, and pleasure more efficient than the sword. Rahab had become a master at this. She belonged to no noble lineage, but she was known among all the princes who passed through Jericho. Her room was a diplomatic salon disguised as sin. There men forgot their flags and spoke truths they would never utter before priests. She listened and retained them, not with paper, but with presence, not with ink, but with silence. There were other women, like her, some within palaces dressed in silks that hid knives in their words, others like Rahab on the outskirts of the city, far from the altars, but closer to the heavens than any prophet would dare admit. They communicated with glances in marketplaces, gestures in rituals, quick touches during public festivities. It was an ancient code, predating the laws of men. In a society that reduced women to the womb and submission, they created their own system, underground, erotic, dangerous. A world where vulnerability was disguise and fragility, weaponry. When Rahab welcomed the two spies into her home, she didn't just hide them, she read them. She understood their codes, sensed their fears, realized their mission, and there, between one touch and the next, she made a pact that would change the future. Desire is political when it's directed, and Rahab directed it with surgical precision. She knew that to enter the promised land, sometimes one must pass through the body of the one everyone avoids, and that in the game of female alliances, those who know the secrets of the flesh also know the ways of the soul. What if the women of the Bible had told their own side of the story? How many wars would have been prevented? How many alliances would have been revealed or exposed? What if true pacts were sealed with oils and silence? Comment below, which detail of these secret rituals do you think most revealed disguised power? Before the bell, there was preparation. Before the gaze, silence. Rahab, like so many other women who didn't inherit castles, learned that seduction was more than exposure. It was leadership, and leadership required ritual. Not the ritual of priests, nor that of formal offerings. It was something else, more intimate, more ancient, passed down from woman to woman, far from the sacred scrolls, but engraved on skin and memory. The water wasn't just cleansing, it was consecration of the body. She bathed slowly, letting the perfume of the previous night flow away along with the sins of others who had passed by. Her long dark hair was soaked with oils extracted from wildflowers and spices brought by travelers. Myrrh, saffron, cinnamon. Each essence had its purpose: to warm the blood, loosen words, soften defenses. The fabrics she wore didn't hide, they suggested. They were thin, translucent, and sewn with intention. Each fold of the cloth concealed a choice, and each color announced a disposition: red for dominion, gold for mystery, blue for what is not revealed. Rahab knew this palette like a scribe knows the Psalms. There were also the eyes. The painting wasn't vanity, it was language. Black lines around the eyes to hypnotize, charcoal dust mixed with resin. Her eyes spoke before her mouth. They said, "I know who you are, even if you pretend not to know who I am." Her voice was trained to the rhythm of secrecy. It didn't rise, it didn't implore, it whispered with authority. She learned to laugh just right, to look away at just the right moment, to feign ignorance when, in truth, she had already read the visitor's entire soul. Even the simplest gestures, lifting a vase, walking between curtains, touching the back of one's neck, were rehearsed, polished, refined. Seduction wasn't improvised, it was art, an art that men called sin because they feared its power. Rahab practiced her rituals even alone, not to please, but to maintain the awareness that the body was not an instrument of shame, but of choice. Seduction was her prayer, and her faith an altar where she placed herself as an offering, not to men but for a purpose that even she didn't fully understand. And when the two spies entered his house, they found more than shelter. They found a living temple, not made of stone but of flesh, oil and fire. Perhaps that's why neither of them forgot the smell of the room or the sound of their breathing, because there, in the space between fear and desire, an invisible promise began to take shape. If the priests had witnessed those rituals, would they still call a desecration what was actually the preparation of a miracle? In Rahab's house, there was a room not on the maps of Jericho, nor mentioned in the leader's documents. A hidden space, carved with intentions and silences. It wasn't large, but there time seemed to fold in on itself. The lamps didn't illuminate, they gilded. The curtains didn't close, they shrouded. And the walls, covered in tapestries damp with incense and sweat, held stories no scribe dared to write. They called it a room, but it was a temple where oxen and doves were not offered but gazes, where the altar was the bed itself, adorned with purple-dyed pillows and sheets washed with herbs that awakened more than the body. Fabrics hung from the ceiling like veils between worlds. There was no king there, but all who entered felt like deities, until they fell to their knees before her. The sound was carefully crafted. There was no string music, but subtle bells, hanging beneath cloths, tinkling with the slightest movement. Every sound spoke volumes. Every pause suggested something. And the perfume, oh, the perfume, an aroma indescribable, a fusion of desire, myrrh, and the past. Something that invaded the lungs and lingered for days, like a memory that refused to die. The lighting was low, never frontal. The light came from the sides, as if spying. It created shadows that danced with bodies and lies. No face was fully revealed, and no truth was fully told. The darkness there didn't hide sin, but revealed layers that light could never reach. Rahab knew that in that room, the men weren't just seeking pleasure. They were seeking respite, forgiveness, listening, and she offered it, but always for a price. Not silver, but surrender. Whoever left either lighter or more lost, more in love or more betrayed, never the same. The spies who came from Israel didn't know what they were entering. They thought it was a hiding place, but they entered a place that blurred heaven and earth. When she led them to the bed, it wasn't to devour them, it was to read them. She touched the skin of one as one might touch a sacred scroll. She observed their reactions as one deciphers a prophecy written on the body. And then she spoke. But what she said, only one of them understood. That room wasn't profane. It was holy, because in it, desire wasn't an escape. It was a channel. It was a bridge. It was where God's plan took on human contours. The temple of seduction wasn't a scandal. It was a preparation. And if the sacred only manifested itself in clean, cold places full of rules, why would the eternal choose to reveal itself in the warmth of bodies, between the sheets of a woman exiled from the altars? While men measured power with swords, women dueled in silence. There was no blood, but there were marks. Battles were not fought in the fields, but in hallways, kitchens, beds, and in glances that pierced veils like poisoned arrows. Jericho was a city at war long before the Hebrews blew trumpets, and the cruelest of wars was fought between those who could not wear armor, but knew how to set traps with smiles and unspoken promises. Within the walls, wives vied for attention, concubines bought influence, servants spied to survive. Words were sharp as daggers. Alliances, fragile as perfume, could dissolve with a single wrong remark. And betrayals, when they didn't kill, exiled. Rahab wasn't part of the court, but she knew the codes. She received news through gestures. She knew when a wife cried more than she should. She knew when a concubine sent too many herbs to the harem. Every woman in that city was a piece in an ancient game, and those who didn't know how to play were cast aside. The woman of Jericho was not weak. She was shaped by pain, by vigilance, by the constant reminder that her position depended on a man's desire, or on the fear she might instill in another woman. That's why, when Rahab welcomed the spies, she also calculated her neighbors' reactions. She knew who would watch her from the window. She knew who would pretend not to see, and she knew who, silently, would wish to be in her place. Inside her home, she kept hidden symbols of protection, sacred stones, braided strands of hair, salt in hand-carved bowls, not out of superstition, but because every woman knew that the invisible needed to be guarded. And while men spoke of war between nations, Rahab sensed another war, quieter, deeper. The war for survival among those who knew that the body was only the first layer of power. The real battle was for the future, for a place in memory, for the name that would be whispered for generations to come. When she hid the spies, she didn't ask anyone's permission, but in the days that followed, she felt the weight of women's eyes. No man noticed, but she knew she had been marked, not by a sentence, but by a promise. And while the women judged her, they also feared her, because everyone there knew when a woman transforms her own body into a sacred weapon, no wall, not even those of Jericho, can hold out for long. In Jericho, a womb was more feared than an army, not for its fragility, but for its ability to create legacies that would transcend walls and kingdoms. Children weren't just children, they were living currency, walking inheritances. Each birth was a silent victory in a war men believed they were winning with swords, but which was decided between sheets and feminine silences. The future always lay between the legs of those they pretended to ignore. Rahab knew this. From an early age, she had learned that the body was a house that could be plundered or protected, but the womb, that was a sacred vault. So, despite her nocturnal encounters, she rarely allowed anyone to go beyond the surface. She didn't sell her seed, only her presence. She guarded her womb like someone guarding a promise she doesn't even understand, but senses, as the women of the court vied for who would provide the next heir. Rahab watched. She knew that pregnancy was a strategy, that a child could guarantee security, property, and permanence, but she also knew that not all children were welcome, especially those born of unauthorized alliances. In Jericho, a woman could be exalted or stoned for the same act, giving birth. And then, that night, when the spies arrived, and she sealed a pact with one of them, something in her changed. It wasn't passion, nor sudden faith. It was a deep, almost animal intuition, as if time had folded around her body and she felt for an instant something begin inside her, something that didn't yet exist, but was already pulsing. History doesn't say whether Rahab conceived that night, but centuries later, her name appears among the ancestors of David, and later among those of Jesus. How can this be explained? How does a prostitute, cursed by the purity of the Pharisees, become part of the Savior's seed? The scribes don't explain. Theologians skip over it, but the truth is there, engraved in genealogies that no one reads carefully. Rahab not only embraced God's plan, she conceived it. She became fertile ground for a promise that wasn't born in the temple, but on the shore. Her children, her descendants, carried not only the blood of the Hebrews, but the perfume of Jericho, the silence of the room, the strength of a woman who dared to transform shame into inheritance. And perhaps that's why, to this day, her name causes discomfort, because Rahab shouldn't be there, and yet she is, engraved, honored, and eternal. No decree was signed, but the future was decided between the sheets. Do you believe that the true power in Israel was on the throne, or in the womb of those who knew how to use it? When armies advance, the gods retreat in silence. But when women lie with foreigners, the gods look into each other's eyes and tremble. In Jericho, faith was stone. It was ritual. It was a spectacle for the people's eyes. But in the stuffy rooms amidst oils and veils, other devotions manifested themselves, not with screams but with moans, not with altar fire, but with the heat of skin. The sacred mingled with the profane, with the naturalness of those who never separated one from the other. And Rahab knew all the names of the gods and all their secrets. She had learned early on that imposed faith was a prison. Therefore, her spirituality was liquid, adaptable, invisible. She carried amulets hidden between her breasts, invoked blessings with closed eyes while serving wine. She was a priestess without an altar, a devotee without religion. With each man who entered her room, she felt the weight of the gods he carried on his shoulders. Some came with idols around their necks, others with guilt glued to their skin, but all upon sleeping with her emerged different. Because there, beneath the covers, there was not just pleasure, there was a collision of divinities. The God of Israel was a stranger in that city, a murmuring name from the desert, feared by rumors, ignored by the local altars. But Rahab sensed his approach before the priests. She didn't know him, but she sensed him, and perhaps that's why she was chosen, because the faceless God always chose places where idols no longer reigned, and bodies where faith still breathed, even under the weight of desire. The Bible doesn't detail the cults of foreign women, but archaeologists have found traces. Small idols hidden in clay pots, fragments of prayers, carved into shells, cloths dyed with symbols that spoke of fertility, the moon, and blood. Rahab belonged to this world, not the world of laws, but the world of cycles. She knew when the sky changed hue. She knew when her womb called for silence. She knew that sometimes the true altar was her own body, given not to any god, but to the greater mystery that no name could contain. And that night the spies slept under their roof. They may not have realized it, but they participated in a cult, not pagan, not Hebrew, a cult older than the books, that of surrender, the fusion of faith and flesh, between fear and revelation. When Rahab swore allegiance to their God, she didn't abandon what she already was. She simply added to it. And that's what scares purists most, the possibility that the faith that saved Israel was born of the mixture. If the sacred were only pure, how could we explain an eternal promise born from the womb of a woman marked by so many gods? The walls of Jericho didn't fall because of trumpets. They fell because they were already hollow within. The sound that brought them down was merely the final echo of a collapse that had begun long before, in the corridors of lust, in the silent kisses exchanged between empty oaths and corrupted alliances. While men proclaimed power on altars and in assemblies, the city's true weakening took place in hushed rooms, amid worn sheets and cursed whispers. In Jericho, pleasure ceased to be a celebration and became a currency. It was traded, manipulated, used to silence prophecies, to buy silence, to numb consciences. The priests bowed to the offerings of meat. The leaders turned a blind eye to the scandals of the temple, and the gods, even the false ones, were ashamed of the corruption they called worship. Rahab saw everything from the inside. She was a prostitute, yes, but also a sentinel. She heard confessions that never reached the prophets. She knew of the pacts that sold the city itself in exchange for nights of eye, perfumes and promises. And she knew, more than anyone, that when pleasure becomes addiction, pleasure exacts its toll. She knew the collapse was near. She felt it in the men's tense gazes, in the hushed discussions, in the rush of footsteps in the night. She knew the people no longer believed in enthroned gods, only in available bodies. Spirituality had been replaced by theatrics. The temple was a facade. The sacrifice was empty. That's why, when the spies arrived, Rahab recognized something different in them, a fear that wasn't panic but reverence, a purpose that didn't seek pleasure but promise. And so there, amidst all that was rotting, she saw a chance to deliver her home and her story to another destiny. The city fell because it could no longer support its own weight, the weight of lies, the weight of sensuality used as a distraction, not a path, the weight of the hypocrisy of the fake saints who condemned Rahab while lining up at her door. When the walls collapsed, it wasn't just the stone that fell. It was the empire of false holiness. It was the system where those who seemed pure were, in fact, the most lost. And when the dust settled, Rahab stood, not as a victim, nor as a survivor, but as a witness, because she had paid the price for pleasure. But in silence she had also bargained for the future, and the God who came to destroy before that chose her to preserve. Perhaps true judgment doesn't come with fire. Perhaps it comes when pleasure itself turns against those who defiled it. What happened between Rahab and God's chosen one that night was never detailed in Scripture. No scribe dared to write what transpired between the perfume and the covenant. Perhaps because what transpired there was not just a physical act, it was a cosmic moment where two worlds touched without the temple's permission, and what was born of that encounter, though not recorded in sacred scrolls, was tattooed in the eternal lineage of promise. Because what no one told you is that Rahab didn't just hide spies. She sealed that night with her presence a new beginning, a new kind of covenant, not written on tablets, but carved in the flesh. A covenant where the sacred ceased to be the exclusive territory of the pure and began to live also on the margins, among the exiled, among the prostitutes. The revelation that theologians have suppressed for centuries is this: Rahab is part of the Messiah's lineage. Her blood ran through David, Solomon, and the one who, centuries later, would be born of a virgin in Bethlehem. Yes, the God of hosts, the Holy One of Israel, chose to mix his eternal plan with the shame of an impure woman, and it was no accident. It was will. It was divine strategy. Perhaps this is why the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel begins with a silent scandal, the name of Rahab among the names of holy men, a name that should have been erased, but it remained, not as a mistake, but as a memory, a reminder that God's power does not choose as men choose, that he visits the brothel before the temple, that he enters through the red door before ascending the white altar. And the consequence? The consequence is that no woman since then has been able to be reduced to her past. The consequence is that shame is no longer the end. It can be the beginning of a new alliance. The consequence is that every rejected body can be a sanctuary in disguise, and every dark room a secret Eden. Rahab was no exception. She was a model, the first among many, the precursor of a lineage where sin is not cancelled but redeemed, where pain is not erased but used as cement for the eternal plan. Perhaps now you understand why this story has never been told like this, because to admit that God used a fallen woman to raise an eternal promise is to challenge the walls of religion until they fall again. Not all promises were made on altars. Some were born between held breaths and pacts that would never be written. Today, you didn't just hear a story, you touched an ancient crack in the wall of faith. If something from that journey still pulses inside you, leave your like as if lighting a flame in a forgotten temple, and subscribe, because what has been revealed is just the beginning. The next story that appears on the screen carries the same scent of mystery, but the shadows are denser, the veils heavier, and the silence almost sacred. Click if you have the courage to cross.